Hello, and welcome back to Ave Imperator Productions. I'm very excited because today we look at Byzantine Rome, or the Eastern Roman Empire. This is one of my favorite civilizations for a variety of reasons. Hopefully I'll be able to cover all of them in this video. I'm going to very briefly focus on the events that led to the East-West split, but the majority of this part of the series will be dedicated to Byzantium post-Western collapse. So, first of all, the name. We'll be calling the civilization Byzantium, or Byzantine Rome, but I want to note that this name has been made up in the future. No citizen of Constantinople would identify as Byzantine, they would call themselves Roman. As far as they cared, Rome never collapsed, it just reorganized. This may seem strange, since they only held the city of Rome a couple of times. But by the time Constantinople rose to glory, Roman had very little to do with the city of Rome. One major reason for Rome's importance was its housing of the Roman Senate, the first letter in SPQR after all. The thing is, once Rome became an empire, the emperor didn't really want a strong Senate to oppose him. From Julius Caesar on, measures were taken to defang the Senate, from removing their legislative ability to increasing the body of senators by the hundreds at a time. Rome would still be the most populous and famous of the Roman cities, but its political and strategic importance would plummet. A city of 2 million would be nearly impossible to conquer at the time, and Rome was far away from the fringes of the empire, and the relays that they had to send all the way out there could be quite unwieldy even with Roman roads. There was a Roman emperor in the late 3rd century AD, Diocletian, who was famous for separating the empire into two major administrative zones, East and West. This was probably a bureaucratic move and a smart one. East and West in Rome were very different places. West Rome was young, populous, and had raw materials. East Rome was old, wise, and highly productive. This divide would have negative impacts like feudalism, but at the time it was the right move. Diocletian did one more thing. He moved the capital of Rome to the city of Mediolanum, today's Milan in northern Italy, from the city of Rome at around 286 AD. Why is this important? Well, Constantinople was founded at Byzantium, which was an ancient Greek city, in about 330 AD. So, by the time Constantinople had developed, Roman had almost nothing to do with the actual city of Rome itself. So, to the Constantinopians and wider Byzantines, they were true Romans and the only Romans, even though they spoke Greek. Another interesting point, the Roman kingdom lasted about 250 years, the Republic lasted about 500 years, and the Empire lasted about another 400 or so. But the Byzantine history goes roughly from 476 to 1453 AD. That's almost as long as the rest of Roman history together. The Byzantines were the best aspects of Roman society, tempered in some of the worst horrors mankind has ever seen. Just about any time I start a story on Byzantium, it's probably going to begin, the empire was on the brink of destruction. This may sound hyperbolic, but the Byzantines truly fought daily for survival. Weakness would be rewarded with death, whether emperor or peasant. And for 1,000 years they persevered Constantia, even experiencing renaissances of art and learning in period many textbooks today would label Dark Ages. Darkness may have surrounded the great walls of Constantinople, but her citizens would steadfastly rebuke its entrance to the city proper. In the previous video on Iron Age Greece, I talked a bit about the perils of that time, but it's time to update our Codex of Horrors for the early medieval and late antiquity period. Sure, Byzantium had the typical things to fear daily: drought, invasion, and insurrection with iron weapons, and of course natural disaster. But something else happened. The earth cooled in the mid-1st millennium AD, from the warm world the Romans had conquered to one far less hospitable. Previously, the Germans had been content beyond the Rhine, where no Roman soldiers dared to tread. Anyways, as the earth cooled, northern Europe became too cold for the technology of the peoples there, and they had to make a choice: go south or die. They didn't really care about becoming Roman, just not freezing to death. What may be worse, however, was still on the horizon. One quick point: have you ever wondered why there are horses and ponies? You may think that we bred horses to be smaller and cuter, like with dogs. It's actually the opposite. Original wild horses would have been closer to modern ponies than war steeds that carried knights or cataphracts. As the saddle developed and the heavier armor on horse was called for, breeders began experimenting with bigger, sturdier horses. This is one reason chariots were used before saddles. Horses in 5000 BC probably couldn't support a soldier directly on his back. Nomads, who quite literally lived on their horses, became adept at breeding a sturdy horse, and used them to traverse the vast steppe of Central Asia. Nomads were sort of the antithesis of agricultural societies. They placed little to no value on material possession or any innovation beyond the scope of warfare. They were slavers, destroying villages and cities and moving what they took to other areas for trade. Yes, they would trade if you yourself couldn't be conquered. They were pastoral people, meaning they herded large numbers of goats and sheep and horses and cows and whatever other livestock or chattel they could get a hold of. Here's the kicker: they eventually could become so numerous that their flocks would render the ground they grazed infertile to the farmers of that day. So they were forced to continue moving. If your town was sacked by nomads and you managed to avoid enslavement and death, you would still have to abandon your home to go looking for more fertile soil. Why does this matter? So we established that the Germans were heading south as the earth cooled, but not to become Roman. Likewise, people from modern Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe laid in the way of Attila and the Huns' march to Rome. Even if, let's say, the Visigoths wanted to return to their homeland on the Black Sea, all the fertile land had been exhausted by the terrifyingly large hordes of the Black Huns. Return home would not be possible, and as the Huns pushed ever west, more land would be rendered infertile. So North and much of East Europe became uninhabitable, and everyone wanted to go to Rome for reasons other than to be Roman. So, okay, everyone in Europe has to move to Roman territory, essentially. And there's people with a total alien concept of living riding around with cutting-edge military technology God knows where. As the earth cooled, something else happened too. Natural disasters began to occur with higher frequency and intensity. Earthquakes, volcanoes, storms, and general atmospheric mayhem reigned for a century or so as the scourge of God rode around, consuming entire cultures. If you're curious, this cold period would be followed by what's called the medieval warm period, where grapes were grown in southern England and where the Danes colonized Greenland. And then right after that was the Little Ice Age, which ran from about 1450 to about 1850. It got so cold at the height of the Little Ice Age, actually, that Europeans hunted the native European beaver into extinction because it was the only thing that had fur warm enough to survive the winter. If the above doesn't sound bad enough, it gets worse. Due to the dangers of the time, the mid-1st millennium AD became very urbanized. Governments had limited ability to project their influence beyond their major population centers. The Romans were masters of plumbing, using poisonous but malleable lead to move sewage underground. But this urbanization led to some unclean conditions and thus disease. Consumption, plague, and summer sweats would routinely empty societies of the young, old, and infirm. It is supposed this is when the bubonic plague first made its entrance on the world stage, along with several other modern diseases we know quite intimately today. So, this was a very dark, cold period for Western culture and the world at large. Many societies collapsed altogether, leaving very rudimentary systems to fill the void. Half the Roman Empire was consumed by the terrors of the time, but the East held fast. As society in Western Rome crumbled, so too did its population, which led to drastic drops in produced goods necessary for complex society, sort of a negative feedback system. To stop this, the East issued an edict for the West that all men take their father's occupation, a practice which, when combined with the massive villa style of, well, plantation really, helped to lead to feudal serfdom as we came to call it in the West. As it turns out, this isn't really a good way to organize your society unless your population is spiraling downward and crash looks inevitable. Why do I mention this? Simply to point out, the Eastern European states, Byzantium, the Grand Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Austria, until very close to its own collapse, wouldn't have serfdom as they did in the West. There would be no feudal serf in bondage to the land in Byzantium. That was a Western convention for petty nobles. That is not to say that the Byzantines didn't have a lower class. There were certainly slaves and poor citizens. So in the West, your dad had to be a king to make you a king, a blacksmith for you to be one, etc. This was in stark contrast to the East, where an Illyrian peasant named Justinian would not only become emperor, but be a truly successful one at a cataclysmic time. The meritocracy of the old Roman military was carried over, along with many successful Roman ideas: law, religion, and innovation. Possessing these qualities made Byzantium extremely wealthy and influential, the wealthiest nation in the world for much of its history. In addition, to carry over Rome's success, Byzantium had other valuables, one being their geography. They straddled 3 continents, and even though they fought tirelessly against Persia, both states generally kept the Silk Road open at all cost. Even if Byzantium intended to seize a Silk Road outpost, they would usually fight the Persians outside the city, making sure not to affect production and trade there. After victory, you could usually offer to lower taxes by, say, 5%, throw a feast for the citizens, and if left mostly intact, they would generally continue their daily lives. Ancient Rome also traded the Silk Road in hopes of Chinese product, but China only wanted one thing really, other than gold: glass. Roman glass, and in turn Byzantine, and for a little while French and Italian and some others, was always made into the major contribution of the West to the Silk Road, and silk was the East's chief product. The Byzantines, however, had the wealth and reach to do the impossible. During a time of instability in China, the Byzantine spies there managed to steal silk worms and make it back out of China's reach. They made the long journey home, and the worms were successfully introduced to a new environment. This was called Byzantine silk, and most of the silk in Europe until the fall of Constantinople would be Byzantine. Many nations tried similar plans, but The Chinese dynasties had a hard lock on the production of silk, and they punished the theft of their worms with death. And if it was sponsored by a state, probably war. And no one else ever achieved the same level of success as the Byzantines did. So, let's talk a little bit about the Byzantine society and culture. They were an absolute monarchy, meaning the emperor had absolute authority. This was different from French absolutism, however, which arose a little later, where the king's words were literal law. Byzantine law was codified, so every citizen who could read could understand the rules of his society. This is known today as civil law, and is the body of law used in most nations around the world today. The emperor also maintained a court, which is basically where the heads of that society would meet in one room. The court had heads of guilds, noble families, merchants, religious leaders, and many others. This is where politics happened. A senate was maintained, but was more of an advisory board and a country club than anything else. But how could they be a meritocracy if they had slaves? Well, previously I've mentioned that certain societies allowed slaves to purchase or earn freedom. Rome had the Colosseum, where some slaves could rise in society and fame through martial prowess. The Byzantines always tried to outdo their forebears, and so constructed a grand hippodrome, or chariot racetrack, grander than the Roman Colosseum even. Here, fortunes were made and lost, and winners were paid in gold, the money of kings. Most charioteers were slaves, who risked their lives to become something like major athletes in our society today. Wealthy, famous, and with some planning, even influential. There was still social divides in the Byzantine society, as there has always been in every society. People of the senatorial class, nobles if you will, and others who managed to maintain wealth and status formed an upper class beneath no one except the emperor, of course. Byzantium started to have more complexity than most societies we've looked at in the next layer. People who had made good decisions, taken risks, and came out successful. Guilds, organized labor dedicated to a particular manufacturing, be it silk or ships or armor or horses, began to form, attempting to coordinate method of manufacture and ensure the interests of their members. You could say, join the Cobbler's Guild, work through the ranks to the top, and find yourself in the royal court, without anything like a noble title even. In addition to guilds, there were merchants, whose job was not to produce, but to distribute. Merchants in most societies before were independent, seeking personal enrichment or state sponsor. But as power structures allowing the traverse of Byzantine social ladders began to solidify, merchants began to band together into coherent groups. A group of merchants could corner a market and send a representative to court to protect and enlarge their interests. Being a merchant involved leaving the Great Walls and traveling the mire of uncivilized and quite deadly expanses of land beyond. That is to say, rich and comfortable people usually didn't become merchants, maybe funding them and waving goodbye at the most. Another important social divide was religion. You see, the original name for the Pope is the Bishop of Rome, the guy in charge of the Holy See of Rome. The thing is, there was originally 5 Holy Sees, and no one bishop of a see was supposed to be more important than the others. In the West, there was only one Holy See, Rome. The Bishop of Rome would spend about 1,000 years convincing Western Europe there was no other to challenge him, and would usually hang the other bishops of the sees out to dry whenever possible. Being the only bishop of a Holy See in the West, the Pope would usually push their style of Christianity hard until at least the Reformation. Byzantium didn't have things so simple. Constantinople, Aelia, which was the city that Rome built on top of the ruins of Jerusalem after they destroyed it, 77 AD after the Bar Kokhba revolt, Alexandria, and Antioch were all holy sees. A holy see, by the way, was a church founded by an apostle of Jesus. Sure, these cities were all smaller than Noble, but they wielded huge influence in their regions: Egypt, the Levant, Syria, and Anatolia. They provided a climbable social structure to the people there. If you were born in Alexandria, you could probably never be a Constantinopian noble, but you could be the patriarch of the Alexandrian church, which is at least as good. Internal religious strife abounded, however, as it often does, and the Holy See of Constantinople fought for supremacy among its peers. The emperors made a powerful and new decision. They allowed the church to fight it out, mostly. The emperor was, for the first time in history, not the religious head of his society, and a very important step towards today's separation of church and state began to materialize, which is a thoroughly Western convention, by the way. If you don't believe me on that one, go to China and try and practice Falun Gong in the streets without having them attempt to harvest your organs. Okay, so why mention all of that? I want to explain the major social divide present through much of Byzantine history simply: guild versus bureaucracy, merchant versus noble, and orthodox versus what we'll call unorthodox religion. This can be further simplified to old power versus new power, or even more simply, blue versus green. You see, no one, not the rich noble or the influential patriarch, actually had any say in their society's laws and government policy other than the emperor and the empress. I'll mention briefly that Byzantium had a much more important empress than most other ancient regimes. A bachelor emperor would be doomed if he attempted governance alone. More on that later. So, as more people coalesced into social groups to expand their influence, society became more turbulent, and the emperor needed a way of directing their fury away from himself, the true seat of power. The hippodrome had since time immemorial had teams divided by color: red versus blue versus green versus white. Red and white died with the Western collapse, and Byzantium was left with green versus blue teams. Why does this matter? Well, you know how much we love entertainers, athletes, and sports teams today? It's always been like that, and chariot racing was the king of entertainment at its day. Over time, the blue team was adopted by the old power people: senators, nobles, bureaucrats, and orthodox believers. The green team became the favorite of the new power people: guilds, merchants, and unorthodox believers. Through their struggle in the hippodrome, the blue and green teams figuratively fought over their competing claims for governance of their society. It got so heated that the blue and green teams would often massacre each other in the streets by the thousand, causing a need for crowd control and rudimentary group psychology for any hopeful imperial couple. I want to point out one more time that whether you were a born-made blue or a self-made green, you were cheering for and looking up to a slave, or a recently made citizen if he was really good. In societies with harsher social restrictions and limited social mobility, such bizarre circumstances almost never arose. An English noble in the 9th century AD would happily die before lavishing accolades upon a feudal serf peasant, And the Danes of the time had little value in their own slaves beyond forced labor and other miserable fates. Only in Byzantium could a noble child look up to a famous slave, an odd thing to imagine. Not the nobles, nor the emperor, or guildsmen, or merchants, or patriarchs found themselves in their position without competitors and rivals. If you watched someone overthrow the emperor and make the Byzantine people better off after, you would see no reason why any other office shouldn't suffer a similar fate as punishment of failure. One fun fact: the word Slav, referring to the Eastern European peoples, comes from Byzantine times and means exactly how it sounds: slave. Slavs were the favored slave stock of the Byzantines, which is sort of interesting. Previously in America, slavery was associated also with a racial tinge. In Byzantium, it was quite literally the opposite. People with Slavic features, light hair, light eyes, light skin, were seen as inferior to the darker Greek features of the free men. Okay, so I have to start wrapping up this episode even though we've only begun to scratch the surface. I could just keep rambling about the complexities and intricacies of the Byzantine society through time, but I want to end this video with another thought experiment to help you really grasp how society worked and why that matters. We're going to put a little twist on it though, since one person won't really be enough. So, let's say you're a hardworking peasant with grand ambition. We'll call you Justinian. But let's also say you're an actress, which at the time was little better than being a slave and sometimes much, much worse. Born to a bear tamer dad and an acrobat mom. Let's call you Theodora. You may both be of little worth now, but your ambition will be forever hailed. So, first, let's get Justinian squared away, since his meteoric rise is what attracted Theodora's initial attention anyways. So, you are a humble peasant, speaking Latin, considered a lesser tongue at the time, and working in the dirt all day to provide for your family and your community, as your ancestors before you did. The uncle for whom you are named, Justin, has been in military service since before you were born, and had grand dreams of lifting himself from destitution to the splendor of the imperial court. He eventually gets a spot on the Imperial Guard, directly attending the emperor and even being seen at the court. By the time you're starting adolescence, he's in his late 60s, and you're probably not even literate yet. He certainly wasn't. This would all change very soon. Some mishap involving the sitting emperor and whether he's alive or not happens, as it often did. And suddenly, your Uncle Justin is being called Emperor Justin I. The thing is, he dedicated his whole life to getting to that point, and achieved it at the tender age of 70 years old, with no direct family or, more importantly, any direct heir. What was that about people in the Middle Ages only living to be 35? Anyways, he returns to his home village and sees you and your ambition. Would you like to leave the mud and destitution and live in the most splendid city the world over? Of course you would. So, you immediately leave everything you've ever known and move to Constantinople. Justin will spend his reign educating and preparing you, using tutors, don't worry, to be the emperor yourself. But even with his reach, you will still be missing a major something, or rather, someone. Did you ever see the 90s Batman and Robin movie? Not that you should, but Robin's backstory is basically Theodora's backstory. So, you're an aspiring actress and entertainer, hoping to one day sway the masses with your ideas and performances. You're born to two circus workers. Yes, the circus is that old. Which basically means you were born poor and with little material comfort. For much of Western history, Actors were seen as little more than puppets of the poets and playwrights. So even if you're a decent actress, you still probably had to supplement your performances with prostitution. Times were tough, and a person had to use what they had to make ends meet, and Theodora certainly must have been beautiful. More than just a pretty face, you're intelligent and cunning, and do not intend to be trafficked for long. After working the brothels for a time, you discover high officials and important members of society frequent some, and devise a plan. With your looks and wit, surely you could find some simpleton on the rise and couple with him, replacing his intentions with yours over time. At 16, you meet one such candidate, Hecebulus, who was bound for governorship in Libya. Unfortunately, your calculations were a little off. After 4 years, you discover in addition to being a simple creature, Hecebulus is also a very cruel man and unwilling to change. But you are the great Theodora, and you will stand for no such treatment from anyone. You tell him off, and he encourages you to return to Constantinople by casting you alone into the wild Libyan desert. While you are no longer subjected to the cruel imagination of a stupid man with authority, the arid and desolate Libyan desert is little better. You decide next time you won't just pick any dude, but a true Roman with conviction and virtue. With that settled, you set off into the wilderness, aiming yourself as best as you can in the general direction of Alexandria. Before you are about to give out, you stumble upon an unorthodox monk who is aghast at your condition. He implores you to come back to his monastery, mostly so you can recoup and recover from the past 4 years, but also because this is a monastery and they haven't seen a real woman in years, let alone the splendid Theodora. To be fair, the monks treat you better than you've ever known, even though they're sparsely supplied to begin with. They nurse your wounds and encourage your ideas and ambition. As they care for you, you decide they must be living a truer version of Christianity through love and compassion than you ever saw from the old Orthodox order, and adopt their unorthodox beliefs. They teach you to spin fabrics, and you quickly learn to produce marvelous textiles. Now, when you return to Constantinople, you can support yourself with your hands and your brain rather than your genitals. All the monks ask in return for their hospitality is that you achieve your goals, and lift the repression of unorthodox idea and practice, of course. So, the monk sees you off from Alexandria, and you head back toward the city of cities, Constantinople. You maneuver yourself into a house near the Capitol building with the hopes of spinning fine clothes for fine people, not to mention your ambition. While at the monastery, you decided not to just be some governor's wife, but to be empress in your own right. As luck would have it, Justinian had recently risen to the throne unmarried. His short time in the city had been filled with little but study and practice on complexity of law, bureaucracy, language, war, everything else. Previously a hard-working farmer feeding his family, Justinian showed constantia, gravitas, and with his mind for reform in favor of the average citizen, fides and pietas. He is still incomplete, however, a problem you intend to rectify personally. Armed with your city experience, social climbing skills, and raw intellect, you manage your way into his court and catch his eye while he's seeing some prospective women. Their inexperience, separateness from wider society, and decadence bore him, and he consigns himself to a future with a woman who faints from routine labor, until, that is, he sees you, the beautiful and learned Theodora. He pushes aside the noble women, no doubt rupturing their paper skin and glass bones on accident, and beelines toward you. He may not have identical views or ideas like you, but he's willing to learn and to adapt. Justinian quickly lets his guard down, and it becomes obvious that there will be no empress but Theodora. There's only one problem. It's illegal for an emperor to marry an actress, or a slave for that matter. You may not be an actress any longer, but back in your less discerning days, you had made quite a name for yourself, and the rich and powerful who opposed Justinian at every turn naturally would oppose you just because they didn't want to appear soft, I guess. Justinian, wishing to be fair and just leader, didn't want to start his reign by breaking the law. It's not exactly what you call good PR. He may be a scholar and an emperor, but you see he doesn't truly understand what he's gotten himself into quite yet. You decide that it is time for Justinian to truly be emperor, not just in name. You ask him if his ambition for reform and progress is true. He says yes, and you ask if that will involve passing and repealing laws. He replies, of course, he's the emperor after all, that's sort of the job description. So, you offer a third option. Instead of breaking the law or breaking Theodora's heart, why not just repeal the law? If he intended reform, why wait until tomorrow to start? Justinian, remembering that he is essentially the embodiment of the Byzantine government, likes the idea but has reservations. Such a decision could collapse his support from the Senate and the nobles, which mattered because Justinian was on the blue team, so those were his fellow fans. If he alienated his compatriots, he would now have both the blue and green teams grumbling in the hippodrome over him. Justinian's uncle, had blue team ties from his Imperial Guard days, and you didn't really want to just squander that valuable political capital if you didn't have to. But you, the wise Theodora, prepared for this as well. With your unorthodox views and past, you were squarely on the green team. While some blue team members may balk at Justinian, many more green team fans already felt disenfranchised. If you were empress, the imperial couple would represent both blue and green, while also individually supporting their constituencies. Justinian would need to spend all of his effort with the bureaucracy, military, the Senate, and the Patriarch of Constantinople. As his empress, you would offer to take half the responsibility, so together your reach would extend further than either individual. The law was repealed, the two of you married, and Western civilization continues on another day through turbulent times. Okay guys, that's it for now. I really can't wait to come back to this time and get really absurdly detailed, but that will come later. Next week, we're going to have our first look at Western Europe as they regain their footing in the medieval warm period and beyond, picking back up the mantle of Western civilization with the collapse of Byzantium. It's going to focus on the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries AD mostly. I think I'm going to focus on the Renaissance in the Low Countries, but it may also be on the Holy Roman Empire or the Hanseatic League. I'm still not entirely sure, but it's definitely going to be coming out next week. Regardless, it's going to be a good time. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, feel free to comment or like, and most importantly, try and share the video with your friends. If you have a preference of the Renaissance in the Low Countries versus the centralization of France against the decentralization of the HRE, or an overlook at the Hanseatic League and the inner workings of the empire, leave it down below. Like I said, I'm still kind of trying to decide. I'm thinking I might go with whichever is more compelling, but maybe I'll go with whichever gets the most votes. Who knows? If you have any questions or periods or ideas that you'd like to be covered, let me know too. I hope to see you all again soon, but until then, remember, Ave Imperator.